my name is Christian McMahon. I am a CIO for a company called GoIndustry DoveBid, which is an industrial auctioneer running for an e-commerce driven website selling industrial assets very similar to eBay.
Christian, you now run IT for an international operation on a very significant scale, but you have previous experience with growth companies who are facing really the type of IT challenges that comes to them as they move up in size, increase the number of staff and offices. Could you give some insight into some of the challenges you face running IT in that environment?
I think the first example would be working out the scale of the size of the office that you're going to. Very often the person tasked with setting the office up, as in the person on the ground in the location, wants a big office. They want a little piece of the headquarters in their own area. So you have to look at how big that office should be, whether that's a serviced office, somebody working from home, or a 4 to 5 people office, which has room to grow. So what you have to look at, do you go for a lease? Do you go for an agreement in a serviced office? Or do you just kit somebody else out working at home? So that's a very important first step. And I very quickly, when I did this, put together a menu, so to speak, of the pick and choose menu of how you set a company up abroad. And then you need to start thinking from that menu about how you bolster it with the IT. If you're in your own office, you need to think about internet connection primarily, desktops, cabling, a server. You have the option of the cloud, so you could put services into the cloud. But before you had the cloud, when I was very much working on these offices, you actually had to put a server in and have sort of their own email, their own file server, a CRM system that was synchronized to it, and everybody had remote access to that single box. So whenever they were traveling, they had to access the server in that particular office. So it was a very difficult thing to set up and get right, because very often they're quite far away. In the company I worked at that you mentioned, they started out in Australia, then they went to America, and then gradually came in and started to go to France, Germany, and different countries that were nearer. But it was very difficult to set them up originally. One great story was in South America, in Buenos Aires, where we turned up 3 days before the launch. So I turned up with the CEO and some other directors of the company, and the office had no floor. So we actually had to rebuild the floor. I had to work with a local Spanish builder, get cabling in underneath the carpet, and actually get the office launched for the launch party.
And probably not on that scale, but presumably you found surprises each time you went in to set up the new office? Very
often it was internet access would always be an issue, because nowadays everybody takes internet access with a pinch of salt. But back then ISPs were quite large and powerful, so you had to really go with the services that they offered. In many companies and in countries, you had to have a satellite option, and the satellite option was very expensive. So you had to look at the fluctuation of currency against service and the speed of the line. Anybody who goes from a headquarters or a larger regional office to an outpost to set it up expects everything to be as fast as a network in a larger building. So you have to temper their appreciation that an internet connection will be slower because you don't need such an expensive connection. You may have lesser hardware, and you may not have all the bells and whistles that the systems access in London has. Now with the cloud, you have a lot more accessibility and a lot more options to which you can run and share data.
And as well as the operation actually in the satellite office, what sort of challenges did you face in terms of the communication between head office, the satellite, and between satellites?
The biggest by far was data. In the company itself, they had to share a lot of data. So sharing data between people and offices is a very difficult thing to do. The security elements of people taking data from one site to another are paramount. I had one person in Sydney who used to copy the data onto his iPod as a backup. I only found out one day when he asked me to fix his iPod for him and realised he had all his personal data on there. So people become very enterprising in their own niches in their own parts of the world, but sharing of data was at that time the single most difficult thing to do. And obviously people wanted to collaborate, and collaboration on projects was getting bigger and bigger. And the need for consultants to work across multiple geographies for single or multiple projects was very, very hard for us to achieve as an IT organisation.
And presumably much of this was learnt on the fly.
Absolutely. You know, we had to understand the local issues against what they actually did. We had to understand what groups were trying to do across the whole company, as in the consulting group or the analyst groups, how they wanted to use data, how they wanted people to interact and share and work together on projects. And then we would have to go back and scratch our heads and jot on beer mats as to how we would support that and how we would try and help them to achieve that. It was a very uneasy time in terms of effort, because effort was immense, but the cost overhead was very much reduced. It was a tough time for all business. So we had to really do it on a shoestring, but to try and get the competitive advantage and win business for these guys and to help them win business is such a key thing for an IT organisation to help and support.
And given that the challenges of actually in the satellites, did it change the way you saw the IT back at the head office when you've done this? Did you have
Absolutely. I think it changed my mind. At that time I had an IT director type hat where you built everything into a data centre or a computer room and everybody accessed that. That opened my eyes to work out and understand how the business needed to interact and jostle data around to actually reach its optimum levels and work better and relay information to customers. So I think it was important for me to understand the primary investments we made at the head office and on the systems and on the infrastructure and how we could blend it to support many different scenarios.